Inflation is a hidden tax. It's a thief in the night, and you realize it sort of until it's too late.
Federal Reserve is raising the
Fed
interest
is
rate
set to raise interest rates.
Highest inflation in 40 years.
People get upset, but they don't really know that it's the central bank that ultimately took money away from them.
It's very hard to argue against this. Are there any arguments against what you just said? Patrick Newman is a brilliant economist and historian. In this one, we talk about Austrian economics, central banks, inflation, and what the world could look like if it was up to the Austrian economists.
Everybody would love to have a printing press. Inflation creates winners and losers. It benefits the people who receive the money first at the expense of the people who receive the money last. Ultimately, governments are monopoly on the legitimated use of force, and they protect that monopoly through coercion.
Just as an example, in Norway now, they have created something called an exit tax. You can leave, but you have to pay us 50% of what we believe that you own.
The government is there to protect us, only when you agree with the government. When you disagree with the government becomes the hangman.
What is the alternative? What does it look like? Before the episode starts, I just want to take a couple of seconds to say thank you, because I'm truly, truly grateful that you are willing to spend your valuable time on me, because I know there are plenty of podcasts out there that you could be listening to. And you also probably know that there are shows out there that are much better than me at hacking the algorithm. I don't want to hack the algorithm. I want to make the best episodes that I can. But the way you can help me is by telling the algorithm that what I do is okay, maybe even okay plus, by subscribing to the show or following the show if you're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and also liking the episode or saving the episode or sharing the episode with a friend that you think might enjoy it. And if you will do me that kind favor, I promise you that in return, I will make this into the best podcast you've ever listened to. So be curious, keep exploring, and enjoy this episode. Let's start with kind of define some terms that we will, I guess, visit a lot. And the first term, and the first thing is Austrian economics. What is Austrian economics?
So Austrian economics is a heterodox school of thought, so it's outside the mainstream. And Austrian economics emphasizes a couple of things. One, it emphasizes a deductive method. So you start with certain axioms like humans act, and you try to deduce the implications of those axioms. And in doing so, Austrian economics emphasizes the entrepreneur, the role of the forecaster and the speculator in the economy. Austrian economics emphasizes the structure of production, the fact that it takes time for goods to be produced and goods have to be transformed through multiple stages until they're sold to the consumer. And Austrian economics also emphasizes the natural order, you could say, that's brought about by markets, and also the harmful consequences that are caused by government intervention. So I would say that's kind of the concise definition of Austrian economics I would give.
Yeah, and it started in Austria. I guess that's where the name came from. It was some Austrian economists that invented or had these ideas that turned into Austrian economics. Yeah,
so originally the founder of the school was this guy named Karl Menger, and he wrote this very influential book that was published all the way back in 1871 called Principles of Economics. And there were some German economists that didn't like what Karl had to say. They were known as the German Historical School. Karl Menger was very big on theory and also big on markets, and the German Historical School was not very big on that. And so they had kind of disparagingly referred to Karl Menger and his followers as the Austrian school, right? So big Germany picking on little Austria, and the name has just stuck since then. So the Austrians have continued to call themselves Austrians, even though most Austrian economists are in the United States, but the name has still stuck.
Yeah, they've kind of. Is it in Chicago that like the Chicago University in Chicago? Is that where they have kind of reformed or reappeared in modern times?
So the University of Chicago, there has been some friendly kind of alliances, you could say, at various points in time between some Austrian economists and some economists at the University of Chicago. Some of the most famous economists at the University of Chicago who were at the University of Chicago include people like Milton Friedman, right? Very big, influential, so-called Chicago school economist. George Stigler is another one. But most Austrian economists are not at the University of Chicago. They weren't there, or at least in the economics department, or they're definitely no longer there. Most Austrian economists, the big, you could say, universities with Austrian economists right now would be something like George Mason University in Virginia, Texas Tech University in Texas, and of course scattered across the country.
Yeah. You mentioned that it's not part of the mainstream. And I've actually studied economics. I have a master's degree in economics, and it's probably embarrassing to say this now, and then my questions after will make me look like an idiot. But when I studied economics, we basically didn't learn anything about this Austrian economics. We heard about Hayek, we heard about some of these guys, but we didn't spend any time on it because it was John Maynard Keynes who he was the guy, and he's still the guy, I think, in Europe. And I think he's like the mainstream guy. So can you explain to us the difference between I'm using the name John Maynard Keynes. Who was he, and what was his ideas? Yeah,
so one, congratulations, you have a master's in econ. That's definitely it's tough to get, and I'm a big proponent of economic education. So at least when you have a master's, you can talk about economic topics. So John Maynard Keynes was a very famous British economist, and he's easily one of the most famous economists in economic history, in the history of economics. We would say he the most famous macroeconomist, I would say, and definitely the most famous economist of the 20th century. And John Maynard Keynes, really, you could say, in so many words, he developed modern macroeconomics as we know it, right? We could really get into the intricacies of what John Maynard Keynes was arguing for, but the main thing is that he developed a theory of the business cycle, which said that, look, the free market, the unregulated economy leads to booms and busts. You have these animal spirits. People either get very optimistic or very pessimistic, and this causes either periods of high inflation or it causes periods of high unemployment. And the consequence of that is that you need the government to play an active role, either through fiscal policy, the government changing taxes or changing government spending, or monetary policy, right? The central bank changing the money supply or changing the interest rates. And with the government playing a role, the government will be able to, again, in Keynes's theory, the government will be able to stabilize the economy to prevent these business cycles from occurring. Austrian economists, on the other hand, would strongly disagree with this prescription. They would say that the government is the cause of inflation. The government is the cause of depressions, right? It's the central bank increasing the money supply that causes prices to go up. It's the central bank raising interest rates that causes the economy to slow down and unemployment to rise, right? The central bank causes the boom-bust business cycle at every turn. And a very famous Austrian economist, F.A. Hayek, who later won the Nobel Prize in the 1970s, he had clashed with Keynes in the 1930s. But unfortunately, I would say from my perspective, the standard history is that Keynes won the debate. So that's why everyone talks about Keynes and no one talks about Hayek anymore, or at least in any serious depth, unfortunately.
Yeah, what happened there? Okay, so they had a disagreement on whether a central bank is a smart thing, like that, for a country to have a central banking institution.
So we could say in so many words, Austrians would take a very negative view of the central bank. Hayek was one of those interesting characters where Hayek, sometimes his policy prescriptions didn't always line up with his theory. So sometimes to fit in, he would be more supporting of various types of government intervention than, say, other Austrian economists were, right? Or other Austrian economists are. So Hayek, the Hayekians and Misesians, based on the followers of Ludwig von Mises, would argue that a central bank on net is more harmful than it is good. Right. So a central bank doesn't really stabilize the economy. A central bank just creates booms and busts, and it really ends up benefiting financial interests, let's say Wall Street and other large commercial banks. Keynesians, as well as most macroeconomists, would say, well, no, a central bank is one of the most important things that an economy can have. And we need a central bank. We need an independent central bank free from political influence. And this central bank will be able to stabilize the economy. And that's their central argument. And then it gets into a bit of history about, well, what did the world look like before a central bank, or even what's been the performance of central banks. But one of the reasons why I would say Austrian economists and Austrian economics is not more widely accepted is because they're very anti-central banking. And unfortunately, that doesn't really set you up for lucrative employment opportunities in economics, because central banks run a lot of the economics conferences. They control the journals where people publish research in, jobs, so on and so forth.
Yeah. And I think this, to me, is like the core of why I think this conversation is interesting. And I think we still use a lot of big words here for people to follow along, but can you explain to people, like, why do the proponents of a central bank, what are their main arguments for why a central bank is net good for a country?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So first of all, I guess I would say we could think of a central bank as a banker's bank, right? People will keep money in a commercial bank like Bank of America in the United States or JP Morgan Chase, they store their money, they store their savings at a bank. They will also borrow money from a bank, or if they want to borrow for a house or for a small business loan, whatever. A central bank is a bank run by the government for banks. You and I can't bank at, say, the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States, but commercial banks can. So commercial banks will keep money at the central bank. Commercial banks can borrow money from the central bank, and so on. And the major function of a central bank is to control the money supply. It increases the money supply, and it can decrease the money supply. And it can also change interest rates, right? So it can influence the money supply, and interest rates are extremely important in any economy. And modern economists will say that you need the government to do this. You cannot rely on the market to control the money supply. You cannot rely on the market to control interest rates or to set interest rates. They will say that the free market leads to the booms and busts. And if we look at, say, the life before the Federal Reserve, which was created in December of 1913 in the United States, then there were all these so-called panics and depressions. And a panic is when a bunch of people run on the bank and they say, wait, it's a fractional reserve bank. That means there's not all my money really isn't in there. We could talk about fractional reserve banking more if we want to. And this led to all sorts of issues. We had periods of depression and so on. Most famously, the Great Depression in the 1930s. Austrian economists would say that, well, wait a second, you got theory and you got history wrong. The theory suggests that the central bank can't really set the interest rate. It can't really control it. It can only do so temporarily. And if the central bank wants to lower interest rates to try to encourage people to borrow more money, to stimulate the economy, it can only do so temporarily. And in doing so, it's going to create an unsustainable boom, because it's going to make various investment projects appear more profitable than what they really are, right? And there's this whole theory of business cycles, Austrian business cycle theory we could talk about. So that's the theory, at least. The history is that we'd say, yeah, there were these panics and there's these depressions, but they were still caused by government intervention. There were all sorts of banking rules and regulations that made banks inefficient before central banks And so that caused problems. But then also a lot of these depressions in periods of so-called decreases in economic activity, they weren't actually as harmful as what people think. So this is really what it comes down to. Austrians differ from other economists on the theory of central banking and the empirical evidence of central banking.
Yeah, we have to talk about chronism a lot later. I know that's one of your best topics. But I think that you mentioned it a bit here. Inflation. That's something that, even though you're not an economist and listening to this, everybody's heard of inflation. And I remember to me, before I studied economics, and even after I'd studied economics, inflation was still kind of an abstract term for me. And I think might be like a controversial statement, but I think to a lot of professional economists, they don't even understand inflation, which that's like a controversial statement I have, because I think that I used to think that inflation was like prices are rising, and that is called inflation, and that's something that is good. We need to have it at 2% because the government says so. That's kind of a rule that is stated. Everybody, the media is saying it, and that's kind of the goal, and it's a good thing. But I think a lot of people are not stopping and saying why. But and then I also thought that inflation as like the all goods we have in society, like we have some way of measuring all goods, and the average price increase of all goods is inflation. Like that is what I thought. But then I learned that no, that it's, especially in Norway, at least the way it works in Norway, and it's probably the same in the US, is that there's some seemingly intelligent people who are placing different goods in a basket. And that basket is supposed to be the measurement of inflation in society. And what they do is that, let's say, for example, electricity goes up by a lot. Then they say, "Oops, that is an outlier. We should take out electricity and put coffee in there now, because coffee has just risen like with 2%, and that makes inflation look better. We can present that it's still on 2% inflation, people." But this is something that I like. If you look at housing prices in the West, I think housing prices as a better measurement of real inflation than the reported inflation. Could you elaborate on this? Like this is just my first principle thinking thoughts as a barely economist from Norway.
Yeah, no, so you make a lot of great points. So you're definitely right that economists, at least most economists, at least especially from the Austrian perspective, Austrians would say that most economists don't really understand inflation, right? And to an extent, the public also doesn't understand inflation, but we all experience inflation, right? So you're right that the standard definition of inflation is an increase in the general level of prices, or it's known as the price level. So imagine if prices across the board throughout the economy rose 5% in 1 year. The inflation rate, again, according to the standard definition, would be 5%. And everything has gotten 5% more expensive. Now, of course, this in theory would also include the price of labor, like wages and so on, but we can talk about that later. So Austrians would say that, well, the main cause of inflation, such as the cause of the significant increases in prices that happened after COVID around the world in the United States and other countries, is an increase in the money supply, right? That enables people to increase their demand for goods, and that's what pushes prices up. So if you look at just the increase in prices, you're not actually really getting at the cause, right? Which is the increase in the money supply. And that's why, especially a couple years ago in 2021, 2022, we heard all the stuff about greed and supply shocks or supply chain disruptions and stuff. And of course, decreases in the supplies of goods can drive up prices, but that's isolated places. It's not throughout the entire economy, or at least it's something that's not sustainable. And it's not just as if people became more greedy all of a sudden. Like when prices go up, it's an increase in greed, or when prices go down, it's a decrease in greed, right? That's an incorrect theory. It's really the money supply that drives increases in prices. And one of the reasons why people don't like inflation is because prices do not rise across the board, an even 5%, as sometimes the standard theory teaches it. what happens is that some prices rise more than others, right? So some prices go up 8%, some prices go up 2%. And what that means is once you take in consideration the fact that the price of labor is also going to be affected by an increase in the money supply, and some wages are going to go up by 8%, or some wages are only going to go up by 2%, inflation creates winners and losers.
Yes.
Right? It benefits the people who receive the money first,
Yes.
at the expense of the people who receive the money last.
Yeah,
Right?
this
is why people
let's
go on.
let's dwell on this for a second, because this is also something that I think a lot of people don't know, is that how money is being created, at least in Norway. I'm guessing it's the same in the US, that if I want to buy a house, the bank doesn't have that money. They don't have the cash in the vaults. So they just invent the money, and I have the money first. So the people who are benefiting of an inflationary system are always the one who has the biggest ability to loan as much as possible, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The people who benefit from inflation are what the Austrians would call the early receivers of the money, right? The newly created money. So the central bank creates money. The central bank creates money. It might lend it to large commercial banks on Wall Street, right? Or something like that. They're the early receivers. Or someone is then a business is able to borrow money from the large bank that just received the money. They're an early receiver. Or the government is able to get money from the central bank. They're the early receiver, right?
Yeah.
So they're able to buy goods before their prices really start to completely go up. They're of course going to start driving up the prices as they spend, but they got all this new money, right? Everybody would love to have a printing press.
Yeah, and I think again, just to make it very clear, is that let's say we have an economy with like $100 in it, and you all of a sudden got 10 more bucks. Then you are the only one who knows that this economy has $110 in it. So you are willing to pay a bit more than I am, because remember, I still don't know that there's this 10 extra dollars out there. I believe that the economy is fixed at $100. I think that is the core. And as you mentioned, the reason why the governments are interested in this is, of course, because then the government has that power of the people. They can, and I'm guessing that, and I think I've heard that the Austrian economists, they're saying that they're claiming that this is a form of theft, right?
Yeah, exactly. So inflation is a hidden tax. It's has been described, it's a thief in the night, right? Yeah. Because most people, they don't like taxes, and taxes are very visible. So you could look at your paycheck and you see how much money the government's taking away. Or how much you have to pay on tax day or whatever. And that's very visible, and people don't like that. But in order for someone to understand the inflationary process and how inflation creates winners and losers, and why inflation benefits the early receivers of the money and why it hurts the late receivers, as I joke with my students, with other people, in order to understand that, you have to take an economics class. Right. And people don't want to do that. It's complicated. And then you got to take a good economics class from a good professor. And so the real knowledge is lost. Mm-hmm. And most people don't understand what actually causes the increase in prices. They only know that prices have gone up. And a lot of times they don't really know that prices have gone up until they've really gone up. Right. Until you start to say, wait a second, what I'm spending each month is a lot more than what I used to spend, or I can't afford that. I can't afford to go out to a restaurant or whatever. And you realize it sort of until it's too late. And people get upset, but they don't really know that it's the central bank that ultimately took money away from them. It basically taxed them, right? Yeah. And that's, then of course there are some people who do, and that's why central banking is very controversial, because the central bank is the cause of inflation. Central banks are not designed to stabilize inflation. They're designed to create inflation, to benefit the government, to benefit commercial interests, and so on.
Are there any, to me, this is very hard to argue against this. Are there any arguments against what you just said?
Yeah. So there of course are. I would disagree with them. People would say, especially a lot of interventionist economists or economists who are more socialist, they would say, well, the real reason for increases in prices is disruptions to the supply chain. They sort of look at supply and demand and they say, well, increases in demand can't cause higher prices. It's all from the supply side. Or they'll say that, well, central banks can they stabilize the prices, and they say, well, good central banks like the Fed, they're not going to have 10% inflation. They're going to have 2% inflation. Right? I myself would say something like, well, it's very generous of them. They're not going to hit people with 10% a year, but they're still going to take 2%, right? Yeah. Being generous and using it in a very sarcastic way. But a big thing, and this is very important, this distinguishes the Austrian economists from mainstream economists, is that only the Austrians really understand how changes in the money supply affect prices and affect the economy. It affects the economy in a very uneven way. All prices don't just rise like a level. A better way of describing it is it's like a swarm of bees. The bees, they go to one area and they raise up prices, then they go to another area and they raise up prices. And then after the money supply has affected the economy, some people are permanently better off and some people are permanently worse off. And we could talk about non-neutrality of money and stuff. That's very technical, but only the Austrians really explain this. And this is why I would say why so many economists have been unable to really understand why people were so upset at the significant increases in prices that happened at the beginning of the decade, right? And that's because it created permanent winners and permanent losers. And people don't like to be a permanent loser from any sort of macroeconomic change.
So you are basically arguing that Austrian economics will lead to less inequality in a sense, because what we see today is that inequality is on the rise. Even in Norway, which is and prides itself as being a socialist, or at least in your view, a socialist country, inequality is on the rise here as well. And I agree with you that I think that is due to inflation and the fact that we're printing too much money, or the central banks are printing too much money. But let's talk more about an interesting fellow that you know quite well, Murray Rothbard. Who was he? So
Murray Rothbard was a extremely influential Austrian economist. So if Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek, who are seen as sort of the two modern day godfathers of Austrian economics, Karl Menger was the father, Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek, they're also both from Austria, we could say, and very influential in the first half of the 20th century. Murray Rothbard, you could say, was the next most influential Austrian economist after them. So he was a student, we could say, of Ludwig von Mises. Murray Rothbard was from New York. He spent his entire life living in the United States. And he was very big in promoting Austrian economics and also promoting libertarianism, which is a political ideology, basically, that says the best type of government is no government. Some people would say very small government. Murray Rothbard and other people, myself included, would say no government. So Rothbard was very big in promoting Austrian economics and promoting libertarianism, both in scholarly avenues, but also in popular to popular audiences.
Yeah, this is interesting to me. What you said about no government, and especially coming from Norway and having lived my whole life here, this is blasphemy to me, right? if you get me, and I want to touch on this because I find it so fascinating, because I follow you on so much of what you're saying about principally the market should decide. That's where I come from, and I think a lot of people in Europe as well come from that standpoint that we should have like a free society that is dictated by markets. But this is the but. I think that in order to have a society with low crime rates and where you don't have to walk around with high shoulders all the time, being like stressed and fearful, you need to have a safety net. And of course, and this is the problem I believe we're having in Norway, is that the problem is that if everybody is just living in the safety net, nothing gets done, right? There are no incentive to do anything, and you have an economy that we have in Norway, we're basically just living off oil, which I don't think is a good thing, right? Because too much of a safety net is a bad thing, but no safety net, I also think is a bad thing, which I do believe is a problem in the United States. And the United States is not a no government country, but it's a less government country compared to Norway, right? And you are arguing for a no government country. And I want to hear, like, this is fascinating. I want to learn why will no government solve the problems that the United States are having now today with poverty and unemployment and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, it's a great point. So, first of all, the no government stance, which Rothbard called anarcho-capitalism, right? So basically anarchy, but you have private defense, private legal agencies, and so on, is definitely very controversial. I myself didn't, I didn't, like, once I started reading about Austrian economics and libertarianism, I didn't immediately become an anarcho-capitalist. A lot of libertarians are what's known as minarchists. So libertarians will say, well, we don't need a social safety net, or safety net in terms of something like welfare or government, involvement in food or whatever, but you do need the government to be involved in providing law and order, right? So it should just be the night watchman state, a minimal government of just defense and law and order. That's what minarchism is. Anarchism goes a step further and says, no, we also need to privatize that. So you have privatized police, you have privatized legal agencies, and so on. So, of course, both of these are very radical ideas. Neither Norway or the United States are anywhere close to that. Interestingly enough, a lot of people, as I know, would consider Norway a very socialist economy, and it definitely has much more of a redistributionist system of government than the United States. But in terms of economic freedom of the world rankings, it actually does pretty good compared to the United States or the Scandinavian countries. A lot of people don't always know this because certain business regulations, at least on some of these metrics, are, they push up the Scandinavian countries like Norway and especially Sweden and so on. But that's a different conversation. But so when it comes to the government, here's something that a lot of Austrian economists, not all of them, but a lot of Austrian economists, and especially Murray Rothbard, would always emphasize. It's that when we think of the government, we're taught, whether in the media or in education, right, or books or whatever, that the government is there to protect us, right? The government is the policeman, right? But as Ludwig von Mises would say, the government is the policeman only when you agree with the government. When you disagree with the government becomes the hangman, right? It is really, ultimately, governments are a monopoly on the legitimized or the legitimated use of force. So they're the single seller of law and order in a given territorial region, and they protect that monopoly through coercion. They you could say violently prohibit people from trying to provide law and order or do other things, right? They are backed by the use of force. The most successful governments are the ones with the most guns, so to speak. And I've taught this in several classes before and in other settings, that when you actually look at the history of governments and how they've originated, whether in Europe or in Asia or in the Middle East or so on, and then later in North America and the United States, it's almost always been through conquest, right? It's through a bunch of people invading an area. They take it over. They kill off the existing government leaders, or they imprison them or whatever, or if there wasn't even a government before, they just set up shop and they say, all right, we're going to run this place, right? You're going to have to pay us taxes. You're going to have to listen to us. We might have to draft some of your men. We might have to take some of your livestock, whatever, right? And in doing so, we will protect you, right? And I teach this to my students. This might hit home with you. It's what's known as Stockholm syndrome, right? Yeah. It's when someone gets kidnapped and then eventually they learn to love their master. They don't want to break free because they get so used to being trapped in a basement or, something like that, that they say, I can't leave. I don't know what I'll do. And that's really what happens with most people. governments have relied on coercion, and they continue to rely on coercion. But
the argument against this,
Yeah.
the argument against this would be that if you have a democratically elected government that is representing the majority of the people, and of course you could have like I don't know what you call it in English, but when you have like the tyranny of the majority, of course you could have that, but you have also both the U.S. and Norway have like systems in place to have some checks and balances for that. So I get you. If you describe a government now, you describe it as like a mafia, right? You come into territory and you say I have the biggest muscles, the biggest guns, the biggest goons. So now you have to pay me protection money, and I will protect you. Yes, but if you disagree with me, I will kill you, right? And but I don't think modern Western governments work that way.
Well, I think that is one of, I guess I would say, sort of an eye-opening thing that, of course, if we, whenever we talk about the origins of government, we think of like a king or a despot or, someone who's just, in total control and can do what they want. And, that's how governments used to be. But nowadays we have democratically elected leaders and they are the ones who, they end up promoting the public good, because if they don't, well, they will get voted out. And I think when it comes to democracy and even how democracies have originated or evolved, it might not be as extreme as, say, a despot or a king ruling, but you still definitely have that element of coercion, and you don't have as much choice as people think, or what the much choices you have on the market, right? So we think about how modern democratic systems work. It's not really run by the people, and there isn't really this continual cycling out of leaders. What it really is it's special interests that run the government, and it's elites that respond to those special interests. So you have a tight-knit group of elites, whether it's in the United States or whether it's in Norway or in other countries in Europe or in the democratic countries, and they are in a large way, they're able to kind of do what they want, right? There of course are restrictions and people, there's scandals and so on, and you might not be able to kill people as easily, but there are always people, especially in America, who are convinced that our political leaders are able to get away with this stuff. Maybe not to as much of an extent as in other countries, but the democratic system, it really isn't as voluntary as people think. You certainly can't leave it, right? You can't break away.
Yeah, that's 100% true. And just as an example, in Norway now, they have created something called an exit tax, where because they instituted a wealth tax in Norway that, of course, made the rich people here upset, and they said, okay, if you don't want to have us here, we will leave. And a lot of people left. They went to Switzerland. And then the government was like, oh shit, we have to do something. So they either had they could remove the wealth tax, and then of course the people would hopefully be happy and then stay. But they kind of knew that they had already shown their cards. They're willing to do this now, and the rich people would go anyways. So what they did then, they set up a fence and said that you can leave, but you have to pay us 50% of what we believe that you own, and you have to pay it now. And of course, it's impossible. Then you're stuck. It's a prison. Which is, I agree with you. Which is a problem. I don't think that should be allowed, and I think that is a problem, because I believe that you should. I think I believe in the nation state and the governments more than you do, and I will continue with our conversation where we're now. Yeah. But the reason why I think there should be several nation states, and they should compete. And if I don't like living in Norway, then I will move, and it should be easy for me to move to another place. And if I am, or if the new country would like to have me, and if I'm intelligent and I'm able to create businesses, create value, then that new country would hopefully invite me in with open arms. And that's how it should work. But okay, continue with your rant against the tyrannical government.
Yeah, no, I'm very glad you mentioned that, because exit taxes are an example of democracy isn't really as voluntary as what people think. And more fundamentally, we could say, you mentioned having multiple nation states would be good, and it certainly, I would argue there's many benefits from that. That's precisely why modern governments, they are so democratically elected governments where the people have choice, the ability to choose, as we're told. They are so vehemently against any type of secession or decentralization, where let's say you have a part of Norway that doesn't want to be part of Norway anymore, or a part of the United States that doesn't want to be part of the United States. Some real world examples of this, I think a couple of years ago, last decade, it was the Catalonia secessionist movement in Spain, or Kurdistan, which is the Kurds, people in northern Iraq and in Turkey. If they want to break away and form their own government, you will not be able to participate in that social contract, so to speak. Modern governments, democratically elected governments, that is a absolute red line for them. They will crush you without dissent, because that's sort of much more of the voluntary, or people have choice. Instead, you're basically, you can at best move around between the existing nation states, but the existing nation states cannot be broken up or divided or go out of business, quote unquote, much like an actual business can. So that's a huge reason as to why really democracies, despite all of the rhetoric used, they're not really as voluntary as we sometimes think they are.
This it's interesting that you mentioned that. If one looks at a nation state as a business, I guess Greece, like there's potential for bankruptcy also for nations, but of course they're it's still a nation, so they don't we don't lose them forever.
Yeah, it's still a nation. And especially like someone like Greece, a country like Greece, there's another even bigger backstop, right? Say the European Union, and before, Greece could at least print its own money, right? It doesn't do that anymore, but now they have the European Central Bank. But yeah, Greece itself, like the actual country, the boundaries. And this isn't just a geographical point. This gets to the heart as to how much choice do people actually have in a democracy. They certainly might have more choice than an autocracy or governments that have, repress political freedoms and, market freedoms. And I'm not denying that. But they still have, they're still based on coercion fundamentally, because you can't break away. And a lot of times in these countries, you're voting between the quote unquote lesser of two evils. It's always a lump sum choice. When you decide to go to a business or to not go to a business, you can say, all right, I can choose to buy a sandwich there, or I can choose not to buy a sandwich there, and I can go somewhere else, right? When it comes to politicians, especially in the United States, there's two types of politicians largely. There's Republicans, there's Democrats, and you're voting on sort of a lump sum set of policy prescriptions. It's like you got to take everything. You can't just take one thing from that politician, another thing from that politician. And what always happens is every election, half the population is extremely depressed. Right? Because they're the losers. And the other side thinks they're the winners. They might benefit from the policies, but a lot of times people are animated in politics, unfortunately, not to make themselves better off, but to just see other people who they don't like upset, right? And that's the modern political system. That's democracy. So it Austrians, and especially Murray Rothbard, would say that all governments by definition are gangs of thieves. And this is a very radical take, but governments, they don't actually benefit the people. Their policies end up just benefiting themselves and insiders. Right. And this is a big sort of, it's the red pill, right? Blue pill.
And I hear that. And I think that unfortunately that is often the case. And one might argue that the democracy will always lead to this. But I think that what you describe is dysfunctional democracies. And I think that Norway is a more functional democracy than the United States because we have trust. I think that there's less corruption in Norway than it is in the US. The US is effing corrupt because you've allowed too much money to come into because you've turned that. This might be an argument against Austrian economics as well, that you've allowed the political scene to become a marketplace in a sense where money dictates, like who has the most money can pay for the most ads and can get the most visibility and can get his or her causes heard. While in Norway we have limits to that, right? Because we have more limitations, more government intervention, if you want, where it's you have to. There's kind of an equal playing field. So even though if you're a communist, and I know that people in the US believe that we are communists in Norway, we are not, right? So the communists are very fringe in Norway, and they've never had any, at least for the last 60, 70 years, had any real power. But they're there, and I fight for their right to be heard. I'm willing to parade the streets for their right to be heard. Yeah. And they have no money, of course, because no people with money are willing to put a dime into promoting communism. But then we have systems in place in Norway so that they can still be heard. And I think that type of system leads to a lot of trust. And that trust leads to less corruption, I think, because the people who are elected, I think that if you get caught being corrupt in Norway, the ramifications are so huge. I think that we have then you will be, and I think this is an argument for Austrian economics, or for your take, is that then you'll be ostracized. You will be so it's kind of a marketplace of your reputation. Mm-hmm. And this might lead into what you yeah.
Oh yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Definitely there's scales in corruption and abuse in the system, or from the harmful effects of government intervention or the results of certain policies. And every country is partially different because of the some of the quote unquote natural endowments that they have, or the particular characteristics of say the people or the environment. As you mentioned earlier, Norway has a lot of oil, right? So imagine if it didn't have oil, right? How would things look? Norway also has a much smaller population, as opposed to the United States, right? So it's a very large country geographically, we might say, or it's very long, but it's not as large as, say, United States or Great Britain or China or something like that. So that's another thing that can have going for it. And certainly money in politics is absolutely corrupting. You definitely, I'm at the forefront of arguing that. Money isn't the only way you can corrupt someone, right? You can also have very corrupt communist societies, of course, Soviet Union and so on. There wasn't money, but politicians routinely, bribed or murdered or beat people, and so on, and so you have that, and every country, of course, has its issues. Some countries more than less, right? And you've mentioned some of the problems going on in Norway. So I definitely don't deny that Norway might be a less corrupt country than the United States. I wonder, though, how much of that is due to its governmental structure or just other things going for the country, so to speak. And of course, you know much more about Norway than I do, so I defer to you.
Not necessarily, and I think I think this is often the case, and often the argument against Norway. So maybe Sweden is a better example, because Sweden, they don't have oil. They have entrepreneurs. They've created a lot of stuff. And I think Sweden is a much more, like, they're a better country than Norway, and it's better run. But we still have functionally the same system. And I think that the trust in the Swedish society is much higher in the American one as well. But f that. Let's go back to Rothbard, and I want to hear what is the alternative? How exactly does the alternative look? What does it look like? Mm-hmm.
So, as I mentioned, when it comes to say Murray Rothbard's broader political theory, he argued something known as anarcho-capitalism, right? So Rothbard had written in a lot of fields: economics, politics, history, philosophy, political theory, and he argued that the best system from according to economic theory and philosophy and so on is you basically just have completely privatized everything, right? So you have voluntary actions. You have people who are able to choose what businesses they want to patronize. And those businesses include people not just selling sandwiches, but they also include people providing police services and so on, or legal services and all of that. And that's, of course, where a lot of people will bristle. They'll say, well, wait a second. What's going to stop one gang from killing another gang, or one gang from picking on other people, or what's going to stop someone from not listening to someone else's court case ruling and so on. And Rothbard, as well as other people, have done a lot of research, both theory and history, on how this might happen in the modern world, but also looking at what were some instances in which you really didn't have a government, or you had private police or legal services, and how did those turn out? And actually, they turned out much better than people might assume, and that's because of competition. Even someone in the mafia will say this, and I'm not defending like the mafia or an Italian mob. They'll say, war is bad for business, right?
Yeah.
Violence is bad for business because people can't make money and people are killing each other, right? And what you have is, among privately competing defense agencies, they have reputations to uphold, right? They are not going to want to engage in too much of bad behavior because, one, they're not going to lose money, and then people will move to another protection agency. So even like a private judge, you could hire. Arbitration is a very, very big part of a lot of anarcho-capitalist theory. If two businesses have a disagreement, you don't go to a government, you go to an arbitrator whose rulings are not legally binding, but they can just be an independent referee. If one business says, well, screw it, I don't like this ruling, they are going to suffer a huge reputational hit, and they could be blacklisted, right? Because now people are going to know that, these people do not, abide by agreements, don't trade with them. It's not good for business. We can only imagine how much more fluid this reputational mechanism is now, when we all have phones and technology, and we can rate people, we can quickly look them online and so on. And anarcho-capitalist societies, they will absolutely have their problems. Every society will. Utopia is not going to happen, right, among any society.
No.
An anarcho-capitalist might say, yeah, you might have these sporadic outbreaks of violence among defense agencies, but you're not going to have these massive wars, these huge engines of destruction, right? That is ultimately a product of, you could say, the 20th century. And in large parts, democracies have been the ones who have been engaging in these wars, or at least engaging in these wars against other non-democratic countries, right?
Financed by central banks.
So go on.
No,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah,
What was that? I'm sorry?
Financed by central banks.
Financed by central banks, exactly. Really, especially beginning with World War I, and then especially with World War II, right? So democracies in modern governments, the government has a monopoly. So they are preventing other people from competing by providing, say, competing legal services, or even something like competing defense services. And this is a big sticking point in American politics. The Second Amendment, the right to own a gun. Can you protect yourself against criminals? Can you protect yourself against the government? This is a huge discussion in the United States. But this suspicion of government, or this distrust of government, it involves kind of looking at what the alternative has been in history, and what the alternative has been, could be now, and also kind of comparing it with what are the actual results of governments, right? I mentioned, huge war is a consequence of government. You can't really have a huge war when there aren't governments, because you got to have someone willing to literally centrally plan the economy, draft people, conscript people, force them into the, to the front lines and so on. I mean, that's really like the ultimate backstop of any government. And of course, in an anarcho-capitalist society, you wouldn't have central banking. You would have people choose their money based on whether they trust it. They wouldn't be forced to pay use of money. They wouldn't be forced to use a certain money to pay taxes, right? So we can think of people using gold and silver, or more modern times, obviously cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, and so on. That's something that's a lot of proponents tout could be an alternative to the dollar and other systems. But really, anarcho-capitalism, what Murray Rothbard is trying to argue is just sort of applying the same economic logic that we apply to a regular business, and saying, well, the same thing could apply to police and legal services.
But the problem with businesses is that it's a winner takes all game. So sometimes someone comes up with something that is so smart and so innovative that they just take winner takes all. They take all the market. So what you're describing with all these protection agencies, like when listening to that, I was like, yeah, maybe that will work if there's a lot of smaller ones that like nobody gets too big. But eventually, let's say that, or the one with the arbitrary courts. Let's say that we have a disagreement, but you own all the factories in like in the US. You own all the factories in the US because you are so good at running factories that you've bought out everyone else. And I have a disagreement with you. Then I'll be like, I can tell, blacklist this guy, or go to social media and say that Patrick is an idiot. But then you will just not sell me anything. And you own all the factories, right? So that's a problem. So I'll probably just, okay, I took the loss. Which is still happening today, right? If someone has an issue with a bigger, stronger company, then that business will often be like, okay, they ran over me, but what can I do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the discussion of monopolies, one seller or a cartel, a group of sellers working together, the goal of both monopolies and cartels is to restrict supply and you raise the price. Because, of course, everybody would want to be the only seller. I'd want to be the only economist on the planet, because then I could charge an arm and a leg. I would totally sort of control my life in every facet, and I'd make lots of money, and that would be great. Or a business controlling all of the factories, so to speak. Someone like Rothbard, as well as someone like me, would argue that there's strong theoretical and historical reasons for why that won't happen. First of all, the only successful monopolies and cartels are those that the government have privileged. The government either sets them up, or the government it basically runs them themselves, right? And they are able to legally, forcibly prevent new competitors from entering the market.
Is this the case historically? Is it really the case? Like Rockefeller, was he?
Yeah, so someone like Rockefeller, he ran Standard Oil, right, which is a huge company in the late 19th century, and it was involved in refining oil, right, taking crude oil and refining it, and his main product was creating fuel, not for cars but for lighting, right? You kerosene for like a lamp. And Rockefeller got to his huge market size. At the highest amount, it reached 90%, right? Which is almost a monopoly, but it's at least 90% in the United States, by lowering the price and by improving the quality. That's how he got the large market share that he did, or that's how Standard Oil did it. But what happened, though, is that, and this happened long before the Supreme Court broke them up in 1911, is that their market share started to slip because they stopped innovating. Right? There was new oil discovered. A lot of Rockefeller's oil that they used was in Western Pennsylvania and Ohio, in the eastern part of the United States, or in the Midwest, what it's known as. New oil was discovered in Texas. New oil was discovered in California. There was a lot of oil being discovered in around, I think it was Indonesia as well as Russia. And that was international competition. And Rockefeller had sort of taken a back seat in his company, and the market share had slipped. And that's what happens with countries. And another factor that had hurt Standard Oil was that they were mainly involved in producing or refining oil, for using it as fuel for lighting. But of course, as we all know, that in the early 20th century, cars became a huge thing. Gasoline, right? That was something Standard Oil missed. And the story of Standard Oil is like a lot of other big businesses, and this is why I'm a historian. A lot of stuff I do is history, and it's why I say history is so important. It's because it's a similar story. There's a company that gets so dominant, and of course I'm excluding companies that are privileged by the government. A lot of times people don't know that there's a privilege, but you have to talk about that, and that's a whole different story. But a company innovates, it provides products that people want at a higher quality than competitors or a lower price. The public benefits. The company gets bigger. And then it gets so big to a point people will say, well, this company is clearly in control. No one will ever stop it, right? It's going to be running our lives forever. In the early 2010s, everybody was saying that about Apple. Apple's dominant. Everybody's got the iPhone. Everybody's got an iPad. Everybody's just going to use Apple products, laptops, whatever. But what happens is, even the large companies, they stop innovating, and you can't control all of the factories, so to speak, because someone can build another thing, right? They can set up another plant. Whether it's a cell phone company or a streaming company or a company where you can buy products online, you have other competitors. Sometimes they start off small. Other times they're large businesses and other industries that then sort of move in, right? And if we look at Apple now, Apple is nowhere near as dominant as it used to be. It's suffering a lot of problems. It has not been able to roll out its incorporate artificial intelligence into its iPhones, right? That keeps getting delayed. People aren't buying as many smartphones as they used to be because a lot of people just say, well, the technology's peaked. I'm not going to spend another $1,000 for a slightly better camera, or at least a lot of people. So, again, it's just 10 years. And Apple was sort of the Standard Oil of our day. And a similar thing could be said about Facebook or Meta, Amazon, Alphabet that owns Google and so on. These large companies, if you let the market work, those companies will decrease their market share. They'll lose market share unless they keep innovating, unless they keep lowering prices, improving quality, and so on. And this is economic theory, and I think it's shown time and time again in history.
Yeah, that's a good answer, and it is interesting. But my biggest argument against Rothbard, I think, still is, as you have mentioned it a couple of times here, but public goods. So, like, who is going to care about the environment? Who is going to care about the oceans in the system? Because the way I see it, the problem is that because it's all about incentives. And I think that's where you and I we see completely eye to eye. I think everything, I believe what Warren Buffett said, show me the incentive and I will show you the result. That's how the world works. But the problem with that, then that's why I think might be important. There's an argument for having a government that takes care of the people who falls behind, the disabled, and also the environment and the public good. So how will you solve that with your system?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's a great comment. Public goods are they are the main thing that governments say they're producing. So governments will say, well, in the modern economy, because it's no longer a battle between capitalism and communism, modern economy, capitalism is one, and people say, well, yeah, you have to have a market economy of some amount. Of course, you can disagree with all that, but then you say the government's got to produce X, Y, and Z. These public goods, and the strict definition of a public good is a good that is non-rivalrous. People can't compete for it, and it's non-excludable. Everybody can just sort of get at it, as opposed to a private good. It's rivalrous and it's excludable, right? I can buy an iPhone. If I buy that iPhone, you can't buy that iPhone. An argument of for a public good is something like, as you mentioned, or a classic example is like a road, right? Well, who would build the roads? It's a standard argument. Yeah. And Rothbard, as well as other economists, would say that, once again, if we take a deeper look at theory and history, these public goods can be provided by the market, and they have been provided by the market. Someone will care for the environment when, as you mentioned, it's in someone's incentive to, the people who are willing to pay for that. And that might sound like a callous answer. Oh, well, then no one's going to pay for it. But I think actually when we look at, say, the development of human civilization, it's always been a balancing act between the let's say between human progress and the environment, right? So we can get into something like global warming. I think a lot of people would argue, or free market economists would argue, that businesses are actually incentivized into not over consuming certain resources like fishing in an area.
I disagree.
Yeah.
I think that
Yeah.
I think that an individual business never has an incentive to not overfish. Why would they? Because let's say we have the ocean in the North Sea, and I can just go and fish freely. I will always, because my incentive will be to feed my family and the people I care about and build a fancy house for myself. I would always have the incentive to take up one more fish, even though I know in the back of my mind that this might be a problem for the next generation and the people around me. But again, we live in this anarcho-capitalist society, so why should I fucking care about them? Like, they're not my problem. I only care about my gang, my tribe at home. So we take the fish, or they will take it, right? It's kind of it's just a prisoner's dilemma. And I think that the problem is that the reason why it was a problem with the booms and busts even before the central banks is because of psychology, and most people are not as smart as you would like. I think that this system will work probably if everyone is hyper intelligent and are kind, like generally are kind, and they just want to create and innovate, but they are generally kind. So again, what's your arguments against that?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So regarding fishing, the standard argument, the easy way to explain it, or the easy case, so to speak, is let's abstract from the ocean for a second, and let's go to a lake, right? Where so someone can own a lake, and they can exclude other people from fishing in that lake, right? They'll have sort of security, a fence, or they'll have people on boats monitoring, make sure there aren't people able to fish, right? And we can make the same argument for a forest or an enclosed, some sort of area that can be homesteaded and that can be enclosed. Someone's incentive is not to simply fish everything in the lake in 1 year and overfish, and because they can make money now, but they're not going to be able to make money in future years, right? Because then all the fish are gone.
They own the whole lake, right?
Yeah, exactly. So they own the whole lake. They can exclude people. So starting with that, say, easy case, I think it can be shown that actually in the market incentivizes people from not over consuming, right? Same thing with, again, you've got cattle in an area, or you've got, trees, right? Deforestation is caused by resources that are commonly owned, or they're not privately owned, or the government owns it, and they just say people can fish, right? We go to something like the ocean, and there's been economists who've sort of tried to work through this. The ocean is obviously a much more difficult case, because you could think of, well, in theory, you can't really own an ocean, right? There's lots of there's no enclosed area. But even then, some economists would say that, this is in fact what happens. Companies, they will be able to set up certain areas or track certain schools of fish, and they will see, okay, well, if we want to make money, not just in this year or the next year, but over the next decade, we want to make sure that we're only taking a certain amount of the fish in this area that we've been able to sort of monitor, because otherwise they're not going to have as much fish for later. You get this mentality, this incentive that it's me versus them. I gotta fish as much, or I gotta chop as many trees down, or I gotta hunt as many animals or whatever, when the resources aren't allowed to be owned by the government. Because then it is the case that you say, well, if I don't chop it down, or I don't fish it, my competitor will. Right?
Yeah.
And your time horizon becomes much more narrow, right? And you focus just on, say, the immediate term. And if we look at societies where there's actually deforestation or overfishing or overgrazing of natural resources, by and large, not always though, of course, by and large, it's from common ownership of the resources. They're not privatized, right? And again, sometimes the entire forest gets chopped down because society values that land for real estate or some other reason, right? That is part of economics. But what the Austrian economists and other free market economists would say is that when we actually take a bigger picture here, things can be privatized. And a lot of things can be privatized, and that reduces the chance of, say, environmental degradation, right? And that is, I guess, I'll let you respond here if you have any thoughts on this.
I just don't believe, and I think that using air pollution is a better case, because I have a factory, and I only need like a very limited space for my factory, but I pollute the air for everyone, the entire world. So I bear the cost of like 1 to 7, 8, 9 billion for my pollution, but I get 100% of the profits of my business. So it's kind of, I have a huge discount on the costs, and I will pollute. I think that, I'm not saying that I necessarily will pollute, but I don't think I'm better than anyone else. I don't think I'm better than anyone else. I think I would have polluted in that case, right? And that's why, because of that, because my incentives are like, that's my incentive. The same thing Trump said when Hillary was bugging him with the taxes. He was like, "Of course I did, because it was my incentive, and I'm a smart businessman." And I think that's why I believe that there should be restrictions and rules.
So the pollution, the air pollution is another example, and so you're definitely right. Like for driving a car, right? We don't bear the cost of the pollution, the carbon monoxide. I think it goes in the air and all of that. Definitely, so I would say for other certain types of pollution, and this has been this has been shown, businesses they could face the incentive, and this has been borne out through history, if you have certain type of like really dense pollution, and then it flows and it goes into another, a nearby farm, right? The court systems historically have decided, okay, who technically owns the air or who was there first, because sometimes the business would have to pay surrounding areas, or maybe even own surrounding areas if it's got to dump pollution, in the air or in water, because they are, in a sense, like the damages can be traced, right? So that could still be described by the theory. But of course, for something more broader, like global warming or just sort of regular pollution, that you can't just track everyone with a car and say, well, I live in Tampa, the city of Tampa, and I drove my car. Well, now you led to poor quality breathing conditions for other people. You've got to pay $3, and we can now precisely sort of pinpoint your damages. And so something like that is definitely true. So I bring up 2 points. So the first point is this. In the real world, we don't live in utopia. It's not about what would, sound perfect. It'd be great to live in a world without pollution, but humanity has never lived in a world without pollution, ever. Before the cars, how did people get around? They got around on horses. And we've all seen the movies, and people look great on horses and all of that. But one thing about a horse, and this is true of a traveling horse in the 1890s, is that, well, they crapped a lot and they peed a lot. Your average horse each day peed about several gallons of urine and about at least 15 pounds of fecal matter, right? If you have millions of horses in a city like you did in New York City in the 1890s, you get millions and millions of piles of shit. And this was in Europe and everywhere, right? So that was a huge problem. So we think about, would we rather deal with air that's not as good if we were in like pure Mother Nature, or would you rather deal with air where there's little bits of particles of fecal matter and flying around and getting into the water, which was a serious problem in the 1890s, right? So, so there's definitely that. The other thing I'll say is, not to get into the science of global warming, I'm just going to say that, I take it, yes, the temperatures are rising, we're causing that, and, that will lead to a warmer planet in several decades, as it's already been doing. I don't know the precise temperatures, how much it will go up by. I'm not a scientist in that sense, and nor do I have the comparative advantage or the knowledge of that. But what I would say is that we often when we look at, say, the damages that this will cause, we often forget about how innovative the market is. So we think that temperature, if it gets 1 degree higher in 30 years, all the problems this is going to lead to. Well, what we can't consider is the new technologies that entrepreneurs will develop, or the improvements on the existing technologies that will allow us to cope with that, right? More people around the world in 30 years are going to have access to better quality air conditioning, right? To better quality water, right? Because distillation methods, types of air conditioning, and it's particularly thinking of the developing world, right?
Yeah.
And things like that. So the temperature may rise or things like that, but the cost of that might not be, and I'm saying might, of course, because I can't predict the future. I can only explain the tendencies. They might not be as serious as what we think they are, because economics teaches us that entrepreneurs, they're going to recognize a problem. They're going to be greedy. They want to make profits, right? So they're going to try to find a way. They're going to try to find a way to provide more air conditioning. They're going to try to find a way of maybe, if people want a certain type of climate in a certain region, or somewhere, or animals to exist. There's been lots of arguments about how in the American plains you can sort of move some of this, these animals or climate areas there. And if people will pay for it, they want to go see it and all that, then that will absolutely exist. So I think, definitely there are costs that can never be tracked away, taking in consideration like the cost of pollution, driving a car or keeping a heating on. But those costs, the damage of those costs, we would expect would actually go over time because of technological improvements. Right. So.
But don't you think it will happen quicker? Because I think that we mostly agree, because I also agree with you that the only way out now is innovation. The only thing we can do now is to incentivize entrepreneurs, individuals to innovate. And that's the way out of this problem. And I think also that it's silly to look at these graphs like, if we continue like this, we will be dead in 60 years, because we know that we will not continue like this, because stuff will happen. But I think that just hoping that stuff will happen by itself, because it usually does, we can't take that chance with stuff that is potentially life-threatening, right? So I think that what I might call me a governmentalist or whatever I am, but I think that what I would have done is to say that I have to incentivize people more than just the regular incentive of the market. So I have to say that, okay, you get a tax break if you create a product that does not release toxic stuff into the air. You get a tax break. So to incentivize people, and I know what I do then, of course, is and I again, fundamentally agree with you, but I think that there are some instances where you have to do this. You kind of take away the smartest people do not go where the return on investment is the highest. They go like, I mess with the market, so the return on investment becomes higher over here for a brief period of time, and then I get capital, I get the smart people running to over to this side, even though that might not be the best for the economy. But I think that again, the economy, you have to price in everything, and it's very hard to price in everything in the economy, and it's very hard to price in the quality of the air, the quality of the oceans, and that's why I think that you will maybe get there quicker by being
so something like a tax credit I would be okay with that, as would Rothbard. This is something that actually a bit of controversy. Some people would say that's like a special interest policy, but someone like Rothbard would say it's never a special privilege if the government's allowing you to keep more of your own money. Right now, subsidy is something different. If giving money to these businesses would be different. I mean, it ultimately comes down to, can the government encourage more environmentally friendly policies than the market without unduly restricting economic growth? And I don't think that the case has been made for governments per se. I think when some of these environmental policies are implemented, sometimes they don't even help the environment, but what they definitely do is they harm growth. They make businesses less competitive, and this leads to less goods over time, lower quality goods. So, what will happen in 50 years? I maybe wouldn't use the word hope, or if I did, it was the wrong word, because that's more of, it's like you're hoping for a miracle. I would say the tendencies of the free market or the tendencies of the market would encourage this type of innovation. And of course, it's definitely not guaranteed, because if we abandon the market, we're not going to get these innovations in general. And I agree with you. The solution is innovation. I think, especially with artificial intelligence, humanity's demand for energy is just going to keep going up, and there's not really a feasible way to restrict it. At best, we can try to move it into getting energy from other sources, but even then, there's sort of limits. So it's more about, okay, well, if there's going to be 7 billion of us on the planet, like what's feasible, right? The best environmental solution for the planet is if all of us go away, but that would be a bigger problem. But I mean, I definitely think that this is something that always brings up a lot of discussion. I would just say sort of the general theme, if you will, about Austrian economics, about the free market, is that a lot of people dismiss it out of hand. And they say, oh, it's going to lead to problems X, Y, and Z because I learned about this in a history class, or I learned about this in the news. But in reality, those problems were usually caused by something else. They weren't either as serious as what people thought they were, or they were caused by something else. And its theory and empirical evidence suggests that, or shows that the free market tends to produce better outcomes than government intervention. Right. And that's sort of one of Rothbard's sort of lifelong research projects, if you will. That's what that was focused on showing.
And philosophically, I think you're so right. And I'm sorry that we didn't have time to touch on, to go more into the crony capitalism and also talk more about inflation. And because I think that is also a major point that I think we 100% agree on, is how the printing of money and central banks, the way they function today, I don't think they will function like that for forever. I think that we will, at some point in time, we will understand, and people will go to people like you and be like, "Whoa, okay, actually, Patrick was correct." That's my bet. So, if people want,
I hope so.
If people want to learn more about what you have talked about here today, and they want to find out more about your ideas, where should they go?
So you can definitely find me on X, Dr. Patrick Newman. Right, that's my X handle. And I also encourage people, if they're interested in these ideas, interested in Austrian economics, interested in the ideas of Murray Rothbard, to go on Mises.org, MISES.org. It's a great website, big in Austrian economics, big in libertarianism. I can't recommend it enough. It's run by the Mises Institute.
Yeah, and then people should check out your book, Cronism, Liberty versus Power in Early America. And you have an upcoming book as well, right?
Yes, exactly. So I've been working on a multi-volume series of all the sorts of crony policies in the United States from the origins. And I have the next book on the next chunk of history, Cronyism, Rise of the Corporatist State from 1849 to 1929. That's going to come out later this year. And really excited for that one to come out. So you can find the books I've written, such as Cronyism, or the books I've edited, books by Murray Rothbard. You can find those on Amazon. So that's another place to look. But yeah, thanks for mentioning the book. Yeah.
No, people should definitely check that out, and maybe we can talk again when the book is out, because that topic of chronism is also very, very interesting, and I think a lot of your ideas there resonate with me. So we weren't able to touch on it today, but let's talk in the future.
I'd love to talk about it. But yeah.
I'll let you go now. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.